A very good morning to you, our viewers who are joining us. We're coming to you live from the Uganda Museum, bringing you the unseen archive of Idi Amin. This is a joint partnership between stakeholders, of course, and Uganda Broadcasting Corporation that did provide the negatives of the images that are here at the Uganda Museum. This particular exhibition that starts today, the 18th, by invite, today on the 18th, will continue until the end of November 2019 here at the Uganda Museum. Of course, there are several stakeholders and partners in this conversation, and we should be able to introduce them as this conversation continues. However, this particular discussion we're having this morning is a cabinet ministers panel discussion. With me, I have two former cabinet ministers of President Idi Amin, and I'll introduce them starting from my far right. The Honorable Professor Edward Rugumayo, who was also Minister of Education in President Idi Amin's regime or government. Honorable Professor, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
All right, and also with us is the Honorable Henry Chemba. Henry Chemba was the Health Minister in President Idi Amin's government. Honorable, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
All right, so the two of you have been the only ones this morning, among the very few, to have been taken around an exclusive tour of the exhibition. I want to begin with you. Your quick reaction of the exhibition, maybe Honorable Chemba, let's start with you. You were the first and probably had a little more time to see the exhibition.
Well, I'm greatly honored to have been able, along with you later, to see this exhibition of the events that took place during some of our most difficult time in Uganda. And photographs never lie. And I was proud and thanked God for enabling me to go back so many years to see what was happening in our country, and which many of us are seeing in pictures, and yet they are actually happening when some of us were visiting and looking as they took those pictures. We can never thank God enough for the fact that we are here and able to see what went on. And we very much hope would never happen again. Thank you.
Professor Rugumayo?
I'd like to join my friend Henry to thank those who have arranged, actually discovered, arranged, and exhibited all these wonderful photographs, most of which were known to me, because they tell us a history of this country right from 1971 to 79, and it tells a story which, to me, most of them are new to me, because I left to resign from this government in 1973 March, and so the following 6 years I wasn't around, and I found most of these photographs very new to me, some interesting, some very sad, but they tell a story as it was.
Thank you very much, Professor. And we'll continue the discussion with you, Prof. You mentioned you resigned from the government in 1973. Let's begin there. First of all, how did you learn of your appointment as minister? And what transpired between when you were appointed until the time? If you can give us a brief narrative of that period, from appointment, your experience on cabinet, and of course, your decision to leave cabinet in 73.
That's a tall story.
It's a whole book, I know.
I learned about my appointment on radio 5 o'clock news. 5 o'clock news was a time when people had to listen to the radio, the only radio.
Which was Uganda Radio at that time?
Uganda Radio. And sometimes it carried good news, sometimes very bad news. By this time, I didn't hear it, by the way, but my wife told me and others told me that I had been appointed Assistant Minister of Education to work with the late Ab Mayanja, who was the substantive Cabinet Minister of Education.
Did that surprise you, first of all?
Of course I was surprised, but I had some inkling that they wanted me to join, but I was surprised when it was announced. I thought it would just pass. I had been persuaded by my friend, the late Wenume Kibedi, to join, and I said, no, I can't. I had my other problems and so on, family and work. But then it happened, and I was taken by surprise. Now, my first, you remember, I was the first assistant minister. The following morning, the car was waiting for me. I was then waiting on Mitchell Hall, waiting for me, 7:30, 8 o'clock. I went to Cabinet office. I met President IDI Amin. First time I had to see him. I'd never seen him from close quarters. And he was surrounded by a forest of telephones. There were so many. And they would ring at different times, and he would struggle to know which one was ringing. But in the end, he would get the right phone that was ringing. But that's by the way. So after being introduced, they wanted me to swear in. It was instant, which I did. But before I left, I asked, will I be allowed to attend the cabinet? So Mr. Onmekibedi and Amin told me to go out. They discussed it. They said, oh yes, you should come in to listen in because you are the only assistant minister and it's important you know what is happening in the cabinet. And that was the first introduction to me to a cabinet meeting. When I went there, I saw the whole cabinet, with very few exceptions, was former permanent secretaries. Works, health, education, and so on. Not education, but the majority were former permanent secretaries. And the meetings were really focused. The first cabinet was businesslike. Amin did not usually chair cabinet. He came in, introduced, and then left to handle security matters, as he called them. And the person who was left in charge usually was the late Ovonji, was the Minister of Local Government. He was thorough, disciplined, tough. He knew really how to manage cabinet. So, in short, first cabinet was business-like, focused, and conducted their business very well.
Prof, I will probably hold you on that and keep the bit about your decision to leave in 73 for later. What interests me is among the pictures you saw, and I know the people will get an opportunity to see this, is a picture of one of the cabinet meetings. Does that come to your mind very quickly? Was that the kind of setup? Because in that picture you have President Idi Amin chairing cabinet, and I'm not so sure if that's among the first cabinet meetings immediately after he had taken over office.
Yeah, that cabinet meeting was a small one. I don't know if it was in cabinet, but the cabinet room is big and properly designed for such meetings. But you could see those were...
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. Let me come to you, Honorable Chamber. Same question. How did you learn of your appointment and your first engagement with President Idi Amin?
Thank you, Maurice. My appointment as minister was very interesting, to say the least. I had, first of all, been in government before. I was principal private secretary to Milton Obote, and we were in Singapore when Idi Amin took over. I later came back when we were told that civil servants and others were okay to return. In fact, I came back to Uganda from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, on the same flight with the late William Kalema, who was Minister of Commerce and whose widow is actually in the audience here. I came back and was led to the command post from Entebbe Airport to report to the new head of state. When we were introduced to the commander-in-chief, head of state then, he told me at the end of it that go back to we'll see you on Monday. I said, which office? He said, your office. And I said, but I was private secretary for Obote. He said, yes, you are now my private secretary. Asked me whether I had a car. I said, yes, I had, and I went home for the weekend. So I reported to my office and, on Monday as private secretary. And she gave me additional assignments as well. From that time, I was permanent secretary, office of the president, I was secretary of cabinet, I was pensions authority. And I occupied that role for some time, while the holders of those offices were promoted to high offices. Mr. Bijirencha, who was permanent secretary in the office of the president, was made minister of public service, and so many others. So it was not surprising that maybe I also moved up a step further. I was in that position for quite a couple of months. And until later, I was sent on leave, like any other civil servant or another public office. And by that time, it was quite nice to get out of things. The things were getting too hot. And I was happy that I was leaving the president's office for my annual leave, which I hadn't had for years. I took that opportunity to organize my farm in Injeru in 1971, and hoping that that was the end I had seen of the government. But little did I know that later Mr. Bijirencha, who had taken over from me, asked me to come back to the office as the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Culture and Community Development, responsible for the sports, for the dancers, for the athletes. In fact, famous athletes like Achibua were there during my time as permanent secretary in the ministry. Now, as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Culture, I was responsible also for the Community Training Center at Ansamizi, for training community development officers, and for arranging their graduation. In September '72, I was going to Entebbe to wait for my minister, who was then Ambassador Yekosofati Engu. He was the substantive minister for culture and community development. And naturally, I went early to go and prepare for my minister to arrive. On my way, at about 1, I switched on the Uganda radio, which any sensible Ugandan had to switch on at 1 o'clock to know what was happening around the country. I was then around Kajansi, and I heard on the radio that 5 of the ministers had been relieved of their offices for incompetence of one kind or another. Among them was my own minister, Yehoshaphat Ngu, who was supposed to preside at the function. I was heading to Entebbe to wait for him. I continued to Entebbe and was received by the principal of Nsami's Training College, Mr. Kawuki, late Kawuki. And he had also naturally heard the news on the radio. And he said, we have no guest, we have no chief guest. And I took the opportunity in his office to telephone State House and find out who was the minister now in charge of the Ministry of Culture, responsible for this function, so that I can get a briefing as to what to do. Because we had visitors from as far as Karamoja, Arua, Kabale, Fort Porter, and elsewhere. I telephoned State House and wanted to speak to the president. I had tried earlier to check with the people I knew, one Mechibedi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and both of Fombi, who were close. But they both told me that they didn't know who was the new minister. A number of other ministers had actually also been fired. Professor Banage, who was a very important professor from Makerere, and Engineer Zikusok, and a few others. So I said, please let me know when let me try State House. I tried State House, and the telephone operator told me that the president was not available, but he will pass on the message. So I said, we'll wait with the invited visitors in the auditorium. So I went there, we sat, and we had some music. Then all of a sudden, a policeman came into this rostrum like this one where we are sitting, with the permanent secretary and others, and said, they want you on the telephone. Being escorted from the rostrum by a policeman in those days was not good news. And certainly somebody wondered whether that was the last they were seeing of me. I went out because I didn't know whether the firing of the minister and my being permanent secretary were connected. Because if the minister was inefficient, maybe I was also inefficient. I went out, and who was on the phone? IDI Amin. He said, Chamber, what is it? I said, yes, I'm here at Nsami's training center. We are having a graduation ceremony. But the minister who is supposed to preside has been fired, Yehoshaphat Ngu. And IDI Amin answered, just, oh no, you are the minister. So, Maurice, if you want to know how I became Minister of Culture and Community Development, and later Minister of Health, that's how I came minister, ladies and gentlemen.
Quite interesting, quite interesting. I'll come to you, Prof, because this is the part a lot of people would want to really understand. And you touched on it at the beginning, on how President Amin handled cabinet, the fact that he was really not chair of the cabinet, but was there very briefly. Take us through the few moments you were there and he was there, and what really happened at cabinet.
That's me?
Yes.
And as I said, there were the moments of when he chaired the cabinet were few and far between. But whenever he came to cabinet, the first and foremost was security. He would start off by saying there are many people in Uganda who are still in touch with Obote. And he said, I warned them that communicating with Obote is extremely dangerous. Secondly, you say, I have got telephone that some Ugandans are working directly with gorillas. You used to call them gorillas. And that they're around Kampala So he was going to handle those very, very firmly. Thirdly, he would reiterate, he says, any cabinet minister found communicating with Obote, he'll be fired and face the firing squad. So, and then he would say, Ovonji, take over. So Mr. Ovonji would take over and conduct business very smoothly. But during that period, you began to feel a chill through our spines, because each time he came, he gave us serious warning. And sometimes you'd fear to phone. Those days, East African community had the same system. Letters were coming through, and it's true, but he used to write some letters, perhaps some were intercepted. But the whole issue was we had to be very, very careful to keep to our line of duty, to say nothing, and you didn't know you had to look over your shoulder because you didn't know what was happening now. And that continued until 1972 September, when there was this invasion, abortive invasion from Tanzania. That was a difficult period. The moment that invasion was defeated, and the moment we saw on television some of the ministers stripped to their underpants, wearing in foot cuffs, it really scared us. And of course those ministers were killed. And one of my friends, Picho Adi, also perished in that. Now, from that day of the invasion, Amin's approach to cabinet changed completely. That's when he retired many ministers and brought in military men to manage some ministries, to lead some ministries. These were difficult times, and we can talk about those later, but these were difficult times. But in between, I must emphasize, because we were civilians, many of us, me in particular, didn't know what was happening at the level of the systematic, isolated killings of people in the army, Acholi and Langi, and a few others, in the political class who in Amin's government, as well as Obote's government. You could hear someone has been killed, and so on. But that was very systematic and quiet. In those days, we didn't have social media, but still news would come through that so-and-so has been kidnapped. And Amin's explanation always was, he has fled away to join guerrillas. So that was a difficult period. But we continue with our work, and later on we'll show you what I had to do as a Minister of Education to save many staff members, especially in the field, teachers, inspectors, and so on. We had to shift them, transfer them from place to place, to run away from one place, only be followed by some soldier who wants to settle some scores. I think for the time being, that would be...
Thanks, Prof.
Thank you.
Honorable Chamber, I wanted to understand your experience, or to know your experience in cabinet, because you sat in cabinet for quite a bit longer than Prof. You want to take us through some of the highlights. I'm sure you could write a dozen books on that, but the highlights that stood out for you during cabinet.
Thank you. Well, Professor Rugwanyo has definitely referred ably to some of the happenings in the cabinet. But as you may, some may not know, but when Amin took over in 1971, it was supposed to be a military takeover. But when it came to the appointments of the ministers, they were all civilian ministers, mostly permanent secretaries, except from one or two, Professor Banage of zoology, and one or two others. But most of the ministers were civilians. And the only one who was not military was Colonel Obitre Gama, who was appointed Minister of Internal Affairs. So all you would know around were that Justice Byakaga is Minister of Public Service, Engineer Zikusoka is the Minister of Works, and so forth. Dr. Gesa is the Minister of Health, and so on, civilians. And many of those who were around knew that the cabinet was composed of technocrats and people who knew what they were doing. So that was the position. And Amin's preoccupation at the time appeared to be with the military, because he had to deal with those who didn't agree with him and find the best way forward. So when he appointed ministers, they were technically able to deal with the various issues that needed to be addressed in the country. Problems that we are now reading about, Uganda Airlines and railways and so on, we are being handled by the Minister of Works and so on. The things of education was being handled ably by the powers that, the people that were in that sector, the Professor Kajubi and others. And you would feel comfortable that all of these issues are being done by the people who know best. Maybe we gave him the benefit that, okay, you can keep internal affairs and the Minister of Defense to deal with how to deal with the army. But most of the problems were with the army to secure his own security. And at that time, actually, the cabinet was more involved with things that were affecting the population. And until he actually also finally said that you civilians don't have anything to do with security. So for us in the cabinet, we had very little talk about security, because he took it as his own courtyard. Now, whenever he wanted the cabinet to talk about security, he would come and lecture to the cabinet about what was going on as far as security work is concerned. The picture you saw actually on the, as you will see as you go along, is only half the cabinet. We were then about 18 ministers, no more than 20. 18 ministers. And you've got in the picture there, had about half that number. In fact, the last, there is Charles Oboth Fumbi and I think one Mechibedia and some others on the facing you, and others facing the president then. The last one at the bottom is Lieutenant Colonel Nile Oriema, who was minister then of water and resources. I will use, when you sit in the cabinet, you normally tend to sit next to the person you are used to sitting next to. And I was used to sitting next to Edina Yorema. So you see Edina Yorema facing the other way, but you see just a little bit of my back. You will never be able to do nothing of. That's where we sat. And during the discussions, they are quite frank, quite open, and you know that your colleague who is in charge of the sector is very well informed. But occasionally you would do, you know there's something that needs to be said, and you would say it. Now, when Idi Amin used to come, he would come and lecture to us about things you want them done. And quite clearly, we know that he's telling lies. But this is a military government, and you would knock your neighbor under the foot, under the table, that is not true. And that's an admission which many of our colleagues do. You know that Idi Amin is telling you a lie, and you just knock at the with your feet just to say, I don't agree with that. Now, I will give you one example about the appointment of one minister, which might also interest you. One time, he was very uncomfortable with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Colonel Michael Ondoga. I happened to be at the time Minister of Health. He came to the cabinet, blasted him, full blast, for what he had not done right. After that, we were supposed to go to Makerere for a function involving the university. We drove straight from the cabinet meeting. None of us knew what was going to happen. And I asked, Princess Elizabeth Bagaya asked me to give him a ride in my car to Makerere University. I said, of course. So we went together in my car to the university. On our arrival at the university, I asked, we were seated, and I asked Princess Bagaya to sit next to us around. Princess Bagaya refused. She said, no, you are ministers. I'm going to sit at the back. I am ambassador. I didn't call. Hardly had that happened, when Amin stood up, he said, you see, I have appointed Princess Elizabeth Bagaya as Minister of Foreign Affairs. The same function a few minutes I had given a right to. And one, of course, would have thought that I think Henry maybe knew what was happening. But, of course, I didn't. So we all clapped, including Colonel Mike Ondoga, for the new appointment of the new Minister of Foreign Affairs. So where Amin treated his ministers is anybody's guess. It is what you got out of it. It is how your performance was. But I believe that once you showed any interest in his job, maybe that was the end of the day. But maybe some survived because you had no interest. We thought we should not even be there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable. I'll come to you, Professor Ogmayo. Many would ask, and looking at what you've said, if you were in cabinet and you did your job, you were safe, as long as you showed no interest in his office. But we want to ask, how much control did you have in your own office? How much work were you able to do as minister by yourself? I'll begin with Professor Edward.
Well, that's an interesting question. In those days, a cabinet minister had really all the powers to run his or her ministry. There was no interference from the president. You did what you could with the permanent secretary. I'll give an example. Examples. We would get information about head teachers who were harassed by military people for one reason or other. And then we would sit down with the permanent secretary, Mr. Ademola, discuss how to transfer these teachers. And we do that quietly and quickly. You shift this teacher from school X to school Y and so on. We did that very ably. Then when it came to education officers, they too were having problems with military people for one reason or another. So those ways to transfer freely without any problem. Even the appointment of leaders or heads of, say, Kiambogo or Chief Education Office and so on, this was left to the ministers, and of course with the approval of the board or the committee, appointments committee. So there was little interference at that level from the president. But when it came to those areas that concerned security or his security, then you had to trade very carefully and keep clear. I remember one day, Inspector General of Police Nile took me aside. He said, "You're still a young man." I said, "Yes." He said, "Just one little word of caution. Never talk about security to anyone, because that is the gray area where we are not supposed to talk about." I said, "Why?" He said, "Yeah, that's what I'm telling you." So one day, after the abortive invasion, Amin announced in the cabinet that there was a Chinese colonel who had been killed. He was leading the invading army, and he ordered us to go and view his body at Kololo. So we went over there. There was a long queue of people. Fortunately, I was behind Mr. Oriema. When he reached the body, he stayed a little longer than the others, because the others were not interested. So I followed him, and I watched. This was Chinese. At least it looked so. So when we got out, I said, "Now what? That was wrong. How could a Chinese be involved in this invasion?" So he asked me, he said, "Have you ever seen a dead Chinese?" I said, "No, of course not." He said, "That's not a Chinese." So I was taken aback. He said, "That man, I recognized him because he's dead. We were together at college, doing police work, training to be police. It was, I think, a promotion. And his name was Pope." He said, "What?" He said, "Yes." So what Amin was telling us is not true. This man is a Tanzanian of mixed parentage. So he said, "That's why I tell you, don't get involved in any matters to do with security." So when we went back to cabinet much later, then Amin said, "Oh, by the way, that man was not Chinese. He was a Tanzanian, but I still was right. He was not expected to be involved in the invasion of this country." But I must say, Mr. Oriema was one of the most talented, professional colleagues of the cabinet. He really did his job so well, and he trained us as young people to trade carefully in areas concerning security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Honorable Chamber, as minister, both culture minister and later health, how much did you have in control of those departments or sectors at the time as minister?
Thank you, Morris, again. I wouldn't agree more with what my friend, Professor Rugumayo, has said about ministerial powers. I think, in fairness to the history of this country, as Minister of Health, at the time. I can, if time allows, give you one or two examples of my own experience as minister. Because all I know is that when you are given an assignment, of course you carry the responsibility for what goes on in there. What is to be praised, you take the praise. If your thing is undone, you should carry also the responsibility. Now, as Minister of Health, I've got two very interesting stories, and I think you are hearing for them for the first time, because either you wait for my autobiography. I'll start with the one involving the medical staff at Mulago Hospital. After the expulsion of the Asians and the economic war that took place after that, departments were very difficult to run. Things were not easy. And you needed a lot of teamwork to get things going. Now, among the medical staff at Mulago, I want to avoid mentioning names here. I had one doctor, a very good doctor, but he had very poor working relations for teamwork with his colleagues, medical doctors and medical staff. And I was the minister responsible for the sector. Whenever teamwork was required, he was not playing ball. And it happened, unfortunately, that he was a Muslim, and Idi Amin was a Muslim. And they thought that that was because he was able to do that, because he would had something to fall on. But I felt uncomfortable. What did I do? I took the bold step of deploying that doctor away from Mulago at Nakaseke Hospital, which was then a new hospital out of Kampala, because they thought he was untouchable. I also expected to be sacked for touching on him if what he was saying was correct. But nothing happened. Teamwork was much appreciated back again. And I had taken the risk personally of doing that, because I thought it is wrong to use either your religion or your tribe to mismanage affairs of your colleagues. I don't have any regrets for that. That was one. Morris, if you want, I can tell you even more.
I wanted to allow for a couple of questions, if you would allow me, both of you, okay, because we are running out of time, and I thought it would be interesting. But I have noticed we have quite an interesting audience that includes former ministers and friends of the panelists. I want to ask one particular person, the Honorable Agri Awori, one question, if you can keep it very short. No, it's one specific question. Okay, he's protected. Perfect. All right. If there is a question, yes, there's a gentleman there in blue. Keep it short. Please mention who you are and the question and who you're directing the question to. Keep it very short.
Motai James, I work for the Consumer's Guide magazine. I wanted to find out how was it to work with Idi Amin, and then do these pictures have a change onto what the world looks at Amin? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take the next question. Gentleman next to you. If you keep it as short, we'll take as many. Thanks.
Yes, Dr. Robert Esuruku. I come from West Nile, the region associated with Idi Amin Dada. Although we know he was born here at Nakasero and he spoke Luganda, he was really a great Ugandan, born at the capital city. When I was growing up, whenever you introduced yourself from West Nile, we received this heavy burden of condemnation. These are Idi Amin's people from West Nile. And we have carried this burden for the rest of our lives. People condemning us, that these Idi Amin's people. I wanted to know from you, and from the conversation, it has also been a little bit heavy. It has been difficult working with this man. What are the good things that this man did for Uganda?
Thank you.
That we should also be able to hear about.
Thank you very much. Well said. All right. I'll begin with you, Honorable Chemba. The pictures represent the side of Amin we did not capture, that is not captured in history, and may actually speak well of him, rather than what history actually does speak of him.
Thank you, the two questioners. When you talk about the Idi Amin people, actually I'm also one of them, because my daughters are married to West Nilers, and I enjoy their, what do you call it? Father-in-laws and mother-in-laws. I've got sons right now who have got strong connections with West Nile. And I don't know whether I would even be the right person to talk for West Nile, because I really have the slightest distaste
So is it unfair that they should carry that burden?
I think it is terrible for anybody to think because Idi Amin was involved in this good thing and in that bad thing, all the West Nilers must be facing that category. Because you take all of us, and I don't think it is right. If you do things which are bad, that's my honest opinion. Take it as Henry Chemba, take it as Maurice Mugisha, but don't try to take cover under the West Nilers. We've got some of the best West Nilers in this country. And no tribe can claim that because so-and-so was from that area. I think that is very low stuff.
All right. And some of the positives that are not spoken about much. You want to highlight a few?
Yes. Of course, there are very many positives. Idi Amin was a boxer. Well, does anyone deny that? Would you go and claim Achibwa was a good athlete, but Idi Amin, because he was from West Nile, shouldn't be praised? These are things which we must address maturely. There are many good surgeons. Some of the best surgeons I've known come from West Nile. So one or two passed recently. We've got some of the best civil servants and politicians who have worked for this country. One of them was in the media. He passed on recently. He was in Dar es Salaam. No, for some of us, when you talk tribal, we want to dismiss you from our agenda.
Thank you very much. Professor?
What is the question again?
The two questions. So there is the first question of the lumping of the burden on the West Nilers for some of the bad things Idi Amin did. But there's also the good things that not many people do speak about Idi Amin.
Now, the West Nile issue really is a red herring, because when it came to the dying of people in Uganda, it was across the board. One. Two, the people who attempted to overthrow Amin, many of them were from West Nile. Brigadier Arube and his team is dead, Ondoga, and so on. So the whole labeling of people by ethnic grouping is not really good. I think some of us are way above that. But you young people have to be very extremely careful, because one is beginning to see insinuations in social media about this issue. I think you have to move away from it and face it squarely. What good did Amin do? This is a very complicated question. One of them, as people say, and this is very important, was that through the economic war and the expulsion of Asians, Ugandan Africans came into business. Right or wrong the way he did it, but that is something I think history will have to grapple with. Study it carefully and see if it was good or bad. But the way it was done recklessly. But I'll be honest with you that this issue of Asians dominating businesses in Uganda at the time was a product of the typical British classification of people from different areas. The pecking order was the British, the Asians, and the Ugandans, or Africans. That was throughout the whole where Britain went. Whether you went to America, or India, or even China, wherever they went, that is the way they classified people. And the whole apartheid system in South Africa is a product of the British colonial policy. So these are issues you have to come and study and unravel without bias, so that you can really stare history into the face.
All right. One more? Yes, I'll take. Okay. So I honestly thought we didn't have as many. If you can keep it short, I'll take all the three that are up. Yes. We begin with you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Andrew Rangasibagala. I am an artist, a cultural entrepreneur, and I work with the House of Talent. We are here. They can do their dungus.
I thought they would recognize that.
At the later stage. Why did I make that sound? Because it comes from West Nile, and even those instruments, the aguaras, come from West Nile. So it is important that this is very, it is key to us. And you mentioned that you're a minister for culture and dance, and you are in charge of dancers. I want to know, what did you do in that time that is different from our time? Because we find it, the terrain is very difficult for us to operate in today. So I want to gauge the situation, how it was then and today when it comes to the entertainment industry. And two, we have heard that Amin killed one of our own, the first director of the Uganda National Cultural Center. Did you hear that as a minister? Bayron Kawadwa. So, Bayron Kawadwa, we want to understand also those circumstances, because to me that is an attack on the culture and the art.
All right.
Yeah, so if you can throw more light to that, but also bring it to light in today's era. Thank you.
Okay. My worry is if he goes into that story, we may stay here the rest of this afternoon. Yes.
My name is Kasozi. I'm a retired professor. I have two short questions. The first one is, you were in something that you didn't want to be in, I guess, at that time. Did you ever see a return to institutional systems of management, of managing the country with the parliament and all those? Did you see, when you were there, that the time is going to come that you will get out and have democratic institutions governing the country? That's the first question. The second question, did you see Amin as a strange spectacle that fell from the blue, or you linked him to the Ugandan society? Was he a product of Ugandan society, or was he a stranger? Is this thing likely to happen again or not?
All right. Well said. And I'll take this as the last one. I'm not so sure I have time for the others. Let's see. I'm being asked to really cut this. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Elias State. I work for Makerere University. A question for the two former ministers in Amin's government. At what moment, and I'm sure all of you escaped and ran away to exile, at what moment, what was that moment that was a turning point that you decided, yes, this is the time for me to go away?
Thank you. That was my last question. So you've helped me ask my last question here, which should have been there. I will begin with you, Honorable Chemba. The question on culture, what's different between then and now? Your microphone.
Thank you. I think the main difference between then and now was that soon after, at the time of independence, our African culture was not taken seriously. It was taken as a joke. And when you went to appointed Minister of Culture and Community Development, they thought it was a time to enjoy. Because they thought we are not serious, we are that for entertainment. It is only now, after years of independence, that people now recognize that Africa has got something to offer. When, at the time when we were organizing and sending a troupe of dancers from Kambuga to Moscow and to this Eli Wamala to go and sing in Moscow, they thought it was just entertainment, nothing much. But I'm proud that at least even at that time, we were able to do that. So I think right now you don't have to plead and say this is important for African culture. Everybody must make sure that any function, these people are there to portray what West Nile can offer, what the Acholis can offer, and so on. So I think that one, in my view, is now a settled question. It is recognized. The other one, I think you said, why, the important question, why I think it's better or whatever. Certainly when you are fighting something evil, it is not worth fighting for it if you know that what will come after will be the same. And personally, I'm happy that at least I did in my own little way expose some of the shortcomings and even some of the true happenings during the IDI Amin time in my little book. I didn't come here to advertise my book, but it is there for anyone to read. In it, The State of Blood, I gave credit to Idi Amin for what he did for Africa, but not for the wrong reasons he used. And I did conclude in it, if you wish to look at it at any time, that I think nothing would be better after he's gone. I thought something good will be there. If we now think differently, we have other reasons, it is not because I was not hopeful that things would do. Certainly there is a lot to do with the institutions that must always be there to ensure sustainability. Without institutions, you are deceiving yourself that the thing will survive. And I think that is a fact of life, which is our job to work as hard as we can to make sure that institutions are there to stay long after we are part of history. Thank you.
Prof.
Thanks, Professor Kasozi. Did Amin fall from the sky? Or
is he a product?
was he a product of Uganda? Of course, yes. Amin is a product of Uganda. Properly a product of Uganda, both colonial and post-colonial. Amin was a product of the colonial army, where really soldiers were brutalized and dehumanized. And he also mentioned it in one of his talks, that he would squeeze and kill the Mau Maus and even rob the Karambojongs of their manhood, you remember? So that was a typical product